Understanding past biblical events is essential to understand when future events will occur that the Bible is prophesied about. In Matthew 16, we see Jesus rebuking the Pharisees and Sadducees for their inability to recognize the time and season they were living in. Matthew 16, 2 and 3, He answered and said unto them, When it is evening, ye say, It will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. O ye hypocrites, ye can discern the face of the sky, but can ye not discern the signs of the times? The Pharisees and Sadducees failed to realize that they were in the time of Jesus' first coming, an event prophesied in the Bible centuries earlier.
Welcome back, everyone, to another timeline episode. This is going to be episode 34, and I got Brian there. And we're going to go pick up where we left off. Now, actually, we're going to, the past few videos, we've been exploring different time paths. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to Christ and 7 BC, and then next Sunday, we plan to just go right into 29 AD. And then following that, 33 AD. That way we can get into the whole lifespan of Christ and then move into those final parts of the timeline, like 1988, 1994. And then I'm sure maybe sometimes we'll interweave some more time paths and stuff like that.
Hey Carl, can you hear me?
Oh, was I muted?
Yeah.
Uh, okay. Was I muted the whole time?
You did a brief introduction.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that.
You just said that next week we're going to start getting into 29 AD, and then you just started bringing up websites and stuff. So
Okay. Yeah, I must have accidentally muted myself. By the way, if you see anyone coming in the room, can you make sure to admit them? If you see the admit pop up.
no problem.
All right. So we'll try to tackle 7 BC again this Sunday. Next Sunday, we'll get into 29 AD, and then the following, we'll touch upon 33 AD, and then maybe interweave some time paths, and then we'll make our way to 1988, 1994. We kind of just took a big pause with all of that. So anyways, to get into the timeline, the website I pulled up was a website that a young boy from China had put together for us. And there's some family radio, former family radio listeners that listen to E-Bible Fellowship, and they have like this group, and somebody that lives in the States that he's Chinese. He actually helps to do translations, and he knows this family, and this boy had put together this website. And he's like a young boy. He's only 14, so he's already coding at 14 years old. But anyways, the reason I wanted to show this is because he's also trying to recreate the timeline page. And on this website isn't live yet, but he was able to convert all of the text into Chinese letters there. And he's making pretty good progress. So I thought that was pretty neat. Just wanted to share that. Okay. All right, now we'll get into the timeline.
That's exciting stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, eventually we can really just copy and paste this whole website and translate into different languages. So give other people the ability to learn about it. And it's not just this, but I've mentioned that we're working on a Roku special for the timeline series, which is going to be a pretty long one. It's going to go over the whole timeline. it's still going to take some time, but we're making progress. And I imagine we're going to finish up this series before that gets released, but then we'll be able to take that video and translate it into other languages as well.
That'll be nice because that'll be a starting point, and then people want to explore it themselves. They can come to this website and, you know, play with it themselves to,
Exactly.
because
Yeah.
you learn better playing with it and doing it with yourself than watching something on a video or on TV. Or at least I always do. I can't speak for
Yeah.
anyone else.
Well, yeah, this video will have a lot of animations and it's very engaging. There's no pauses. It just gets right into it. It's able to really condense all the information that we've learned. And so, I mean, we're already at what, episode 34. So a lot of that can be condensed down to a much shorter time frame. And there'll be actually extra details that maybe we didn't include in the timeline. So, all right. So I think last time I showed you this, if you count all these numbers up, you'll get to as far as the Babylonian captivity, pretty much. You can get a little bit farther. You can get into the dates of like 537, 2 years after the Babylonian captivity. And then we have this whole unknown era. And when I say unknown, I mean that biblically, we don't really have any concrete information to lay out the timeline of Esther. Mr. Campion had dated Esther to be around 391, which I think is kind of interesting because it would be exactly 100 years from 491, and that's the date Chris had arrived at possibly for the temple being completed. Because if it started in 537, exactly 46 years later would be 491. So he's saying the events of Esther is in 391, and not just the start of Esther. I think it was 391 for when Haman was hanged, maybe, or when the writing was. But the book of Esther spans a time period of like the third year of the king all the way to like the 13th year. So it's not just something that happens in a 1 year period. It spans over a period of time. What is that, like 10 years? And maybe
Yeah.
more. So, all right. But if you don't go this path, then you have to, because this path essentially dead ends from 489 all the way into the birth of Christ, what we have to do is we have to essentially backtrack to a date we do know of, 1407, and we can start the Jubilee year count. So every 50 years is a Jubilee, and 28 Jubilees gets us to the birth of Christ. So it's like a workaround to get around this era of time we don't know. So you count the 40 years in the wilderness, and then you just add 1400 years, and that 1400 is all these 50 Jubilee year periods. So it's interesting that it's made up of exactly 1400 years. And we showed this time path at the Exodus from 1407, 1400 years. It also breaks down to 40 times 35. So it's 35 periods of 40, or you can look at it as 28 periods of 50. Same math, different breakdown. Okay. And then
28 is 2 times 14, and I always think when I see the number 14, I, for example, always think of Matthew 1, where it talks about the 14 generations from Abram to David, and 14 from David to the taking away into Babylon, and 14 from the taking away to Babylon to Christ. And 14 is a number that seems to be popping up a lot when I do some of these timeline studies and looking at these proofs.
That's right. Yeah, I didn't notice the 14 there. 14 times 3 is 42. And here's the breakdown: 2 times 2 times 2 times 5 times 5 times 7. Or you could combine the two fives, right? And yeah. So let's go back here. So we went over Christ's whole lifespan. So this, we're not going to get into this right now, but just to kind of show, we were comparing David's rule when he began to reign for 40 years with Christ's first coming for 40 years, and then his second coming, which is also made up a 40-year period. And so we're able to line up, you can see the lineup of dates and how they parallel from. So this was another kind of proof to add on top of 7 BC is they're all Jubilee years. when David reigns, when Christ was born in 1994. And so we see the pattern continues down here with when David begins to co-reign with Solomon, 1,000 inclusive years later. These would be calendar years. We're using that term. So 1,000 calendar years later, Christ begins his ministry. 2,000 years later is 2029. And then finally, David dies in 967. 1,000 calendar years later, Christ dies on the cross. 2,000 years later, 2033. And so we see that this pattern will complete as soon as we hit the year 2029 and 2033. Those are like the last two dates that will complete this pattern beginning back here when David began to reign. And by the way, this is a 3,000-year pattern that's been in play. Of course, we skipped the 12,000th year. Okay, so on to Christ. So if you click this tab, 7 BC, and go ahead and read this. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. And she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. So that's Luke 2:11 and Matthew 1:21. So when was Christ born? I first want to point out that when we say Christ's birth, this does not mean Christ had a beginning. This means it was the beginning of Christ's time on earth as a man. And a lot of listeners are going to understand that, but I point this out for if there's like a Muslim or somebody else listening, because they seem to think when we say Christ's birth, we're indicating he had a beginning. But that's not the case at all. This just means that he had a beginning on earth. This was the beginning point of his time on earth as a man, not that he was first created. Okay, so earlier on the timeline, we learned that the Gregorians thought Christ was born in the year 1 AD. So they started their calendar when they thought Christ was born. To this day, we use their calendar, and we're currently in the year 2024. Actually, now we're in the year 2025 at the time this was written, which means they started their calendar 2,024 years ago, but we're in 2025. So that'd be 2,025 years ago. However, we've learned
No, it would be 24 years ago because they
well, it
started
would
the
be
year 1.
2024 because you're getting to 1, yeah. But essentially, you get the point. Okay. So, however, we've learned from the Bible that all the evidence points to 7 BC being the date of Christ, the date Christ had to have been born. So, using a combination of time paths and other biblical information, as well as some secular evidence, will show why we believe the Bible teaches Christ had to be born on this year. So, the Jubilee year. We've learned from the Bible that the first Jubilee began with the crossing of Jordan in 1407 BC, or 9,606 year of Earth's history. A Jubilee year occurs every 50 years, and we showed you this time path starting from 1407, and you can just keep making your way down there to Christ's birth. Mr. Camping took the date of 1407 BC, the first Jubilee, and replicated that 28 times. So 50 years times 28, that equals 1,400 years, which lands you on 7 BC, or the 11,006th year of Earth's history, as you'll see on the timeline here. So you can see that lands us exactly right here, 7 BC, 11,006. And then I put C, 14,000 year time path. We already just looked at that. So secular evidence. Recent history has shown to be accurate when lined up with the biblical timeline when it comes to dates like Solomon's death in 931 BC, or when Jehu began to reign in 841 BC, 605 BC for when Nebuchadnezzar began to rule, and 539 BC when Cyrus conquered Babylon, and so on. So we've proven all of these dates in the Bible, and it just so happens that secular history actually lines up with these dates. And these are just a few. I haven't even gone through all the kings, but they got Jehu correct based off looking at Assyrian records. We found something called the Black Obelisk. And what else? And they used like a solar eclipse to kind of backtrack, when this might have occurred. And as far as Solomon, I'm not sure how they got that date, but they got 931 and also 605 I think they used Babylonian tablets for Nebuchadnezzar and also for 539 BC. So when the Cyruses ruled, they kept records of things, and you'll see that in the Bible, like uh, you know, like in the book of Esther. Notice that a lot of stuff is being recorded. Like Mordecai, the deed that he did. So you can already tell that around that era, they're already like keeping records of different things. Um, so these dates can be found outside the Bible. However, these dates are also all self-contained within the Bible, starting with Adam, and that leads us there. So, what's really interesting about this is, for example, 931, Mr. Campion had discovered the date of the Exodus for 1447, and the date of the Exodus is most critics would say that never happened. Like they'll admit that, okay, there was a temple, Solomon's temple. They'll probably agree that he died in 931 because we have evidence, but there's no evidence for 1447. But yet here, the Bible has given us a precise date from Adam all the way to the Exodus for 1447. And it tells us just to add 480 years, and you'll get to when Solomon laid the temple, 967. All right, well, we know Solomon reigned for 40 years. This would be his fourth year. So there's a remainder of 36 years, and you get to 931. So the Bible is allowing us to get to 931 by knowing Adam all the way to the Exodus, right? And so it's essentially proving the Exodus and all the other information that comes before it. Because if not, we wouldn't be able to arrive at 931. So that was like a key point on the timeline that really helped to align secular data with the Bible. And it just can kind of continued on down the line. I don't know if they got everything correct, but they definitely got some surprisingly with these later dates, they definitely got that information correct. So Matthew 2:12, and being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. So, I'm going to actually skip down because we're going to get into those verses in a little bit. I have them listed twice. So here we read Matthew 2:15, and so the child was taken to Egypt, and it says, this is baby Jesus, and was there unto the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt have I called my son. So the baby Jesus was taken to Egypt until the death of Herod. So we're going to learn a little bit about Herod here. It says, this is the excerpt from secular history. Herod the Great began to rule in Judea in 37 BCE. He was appointed king of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 40 BCE, but he did not secure his kingdom until 37 BCE after taking Jerusalem. Herod's reign lasted until his death in 4 BCE. So secular history places Herod's death at 4 BC. This would be the 11,000th and 9th year. This is just 3 years after Jesus was born, which fits and aligns with the Bible very well. This means 1 AD is not an alignment. If it was 1 AD, Herod would have been dead before Jesus was born. Now, we learned earlier on the timeline that the Gregorians started their calendar at not the Gregorians, but the Gregorian calendar starts at 1 AD, right? Because that's when they thought Christ was born. Let's see. So they thought Christ was born right here. And we've learned that's not possible because even according to secular data, Herod dies in this year. So if Herod dies this year in 4 BC, which you wonder why they haven't even made this, if even modern Christians have made this correction. But if Herod died in 4 BC, then it's not possible for Jesus to be born in 1 AD, right? What is that, 5 years later, 4 years later?
Yeah.
So he has to be born. Jesus had to be born before 4 BC. And really, there's only like 3 options, 5 BC, 6 B, or 7 BC. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but it's a really narrow a year. We can really narrow down the year. It's not we don't have a huge section of years that we can go through to determine it. It's very small. So it just comes down to weeding off which ones don't align with the Bible. And 1 AD most certainly doesn't align, at least with secular history, but it also doesn't align with the Bible. So the difficulty of finding the birth year of Christ. So Mr. Camping pointed out in Time Has an End, page 309, that curiously enough, God did not make a clear or easy way to get to the birth of Christ, unlike earlier parts of the timeline. For example, the children of Israel came out of Egypt exactly 430 years from when Jacob entered in, or we're told plainly that from the time of the Exodus in 1447 BC to when Solomon laid the foundation of the temple in his fourth year was exactly 480 years. And we just talked about that. However, when it comes to the birth of Christ, we aren't given information like this, which makes it more difficult to discover. Mr. Camping pointed out that we can only speculate as to why God made this part more difficult, especially pertaining to such an important date, the birth of Christ into this world. So although perhaps a good reason for this, and Mr. Camping didn't put this, but perhaps a good reason for this is due to how God wrote the Bible. He makes some mysteries easier to understand and others more difficult. We have books and chapters in the Bible that are more easily understood and some much more difficult. And to use an example in the world, we go to school and we're given tests and quizzes. The questions tend to get harder over time as we progress. Often some will skip over questions to revisit them later. And the Bible is very similar in this regard. So I don't know if you've ever taken a test and you've noticed you've come across a question that's really difficult. And so you want to skip ahead and go to something that's a little easier. Well, we kind of tend to do that with the Bible. When we find a passage that is difficult to understand, we just go away from it and maybe come back and revisit it and maybe go to an easier passage. So we know that there was a set time God had established for Christ to be born, Galatians 4:4. But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his son, made of a woman, made under the law. So there was an appointed time for Christ to be born. And notice God says the fullness of time.
I don't believe that has to do with Christmas, though. I believe that has to do with individuals becoming saved during the day of salvation.
But when the fullness of time, this is the verse that Mr. Camping pointed out in Time Has an End regarding Christ's birth. But I'll have to look more into that. I just posted that because he had said that God sent forth his son. I mean, it directly mentions God sending forth his son made of a woman. But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his son. So I'm not sure how you arrived at that conclusion. But Israel under the rule of the Roman government. So at this time in history, Israel was under the rule of the Roman government. Israel was permitted to have their own puppet king named Herod. Herod was a wicked king. This speaks of the wise men who saw the star in the east. Matthew 2, verse 1. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. These wise men are also known as the Magi, who would have perhaps known about the prophecies in Numbers 24:17. I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab and destroy all the children of Sheth. So you can see that there's several prophecies in the Bible that predicted the time of Christ coming. And, we can see that they were aware of this, like the disciples knew about this prophecy and they shared it among each other. This is born because they knew that Christ would be a king over Israel. And so it was a pretty well-known prophecy, it seemed like. So at this point in history, there was a second level ruling party called the Magian. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It's most likely that these Magi who saw the star were from Persia. So Mr. Camping had pointed out this part. So remember earlier in the timeline, we've learned about how Babylon defeated Judah and dethroned the last king. Then in turn, Media Persia defeated Babylon, right? So Nebuchadnezzar came, right? And at the death of Josiah, that began the 70-year tribulation. He dethroned the last king, and then in turn, 539 BC, Cyrus comes, the Media-Persia Empire, and they defeat Babylon, right? So they're the last known rulers up until we get to Christ. Therefore, we can assume it's possible that the libraries of Judah ended up in Persia. You'll recall in the book of Esther, there was a lot of record keeping of events that took place. So in any event, the star that they saw, they believe must have meant a great king must have been born. And when they had arrived to inquire about the king, this troubled Herod and all of Jerusalem. Just check something. Okay.
And while he's looking for that, I just want to point out it troubled Herod, but it also troubled all of Jerusalem. And this parallels how when the elect were talking about Christ's second coming and saying that the church age was over, it wasn't just the pastors that was distressed, it was also the members within the congregation. And so that's what I think it's pointing to when it says that all Judah with him was also distressed.
Yeah. Yeah, and also too, you can see spiritually, it shows you have two kingdoms, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Satan. And you know, just like the elect are viewed as enemies of Satan's kingdom, at least in the day of salvation, and even today, it's just like that similar warfare, and so immediately, you can probably be sure Satan was trying to mount an attack against Christ, right? Because even though as a man, Herod, Satan was, I'm sure he was already starting to mount his forces, to come up against the kingdom of God, especially because he hears about this child being born, right? So in any event, however they found out about this star, and why they thought it was significant, this star that they saw, they believe must have been a great king. It must have meant a great king must be born. And they arrived to inquire about this. So in Matthew 2:3, when Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And in Matthew 2:7, then Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. Herod was also informed of this biblical prophecy by those in his court. So we read in Micah 5:2, but thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. So the Magi's journey of theirs was a long journey and would have required preparations in advance. This star that stood over Joseph's house would have been a miraculous event for the star to be above the house. So Mr. Camping had pointed out that, in order for the star to be seen above Joseph's house, this had to have been a supernatural event, and it had to be, at least a few hundred feet above the house. And we don't know if it was an actual star that's burning, like the sun, just because, stars are made up of we know stars are suns, and this could have been something like a star, or maybe it was a star and God just supernaturally allowed it to be there without it having any type of physical effect. But regardless, he's pointing out that it's definitely a miracle, because some have tried to suggest that the star was just some sort of celestial event, and people tend to do that. They'll take something in the Bible and they'll try to find a logical reason for it, right? And this is just because they have a hard time accepting that miracles were performed, right? And I recall there was a story of Moses in the burning bush, or regarding that story, somebody had found a bush that when you sprayed fire on it, it released some sort of chemical that would allow it to just burn without affecting it. So they try to use stuff like that to try to prove those events, try to find some sort of logical reasoning for it. But that's just it's just a way to skirt around the fact that those things actually did happen. So when they had heard, So Matthew 2:9, when they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. So after the wise men saw the baby Jesus, they were warned by God in a dream to not return to Herod.
Now, one
Matthew,
thing, if you go back real quick, it says, uh, till it stood over where the young child was. To me, that seems to imply that the star was moving.
yeah, well, it moving until it actually stood over.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what he was saying was that it eventually was hovering over the house. Yeah, and the fact that it stood over and didn't keep moving, was indicating that it wasn't a typical star in the sky, right?
Yeah, but it kind of reminds me of how the pillar of fire by day and cloud by night, where the Israelites followed it for 40 years, and it moved, and so they followed, like that was God's commandment, and it kind of reminds me of that.
Yeah, it does actually. Yeah, it's a good time. Um, so anyways, Herod is warned, and so Matthew 2:16, then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coasts thereof from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. So you notice, uh, Mr. Camping pointed out that this is our first time reference when he says from 2 years old and under. So why is Herod trying to kill children two and under, right? And it mentions according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men, right? And so he's basing that off when he had asked the wise men, where is Jesus? He's trying to figure out the time, right? And so essentially, Mr. Camping understood that this was talking about um, that it must have. Well, we'll read this next part. So time reference. This verse is letting us know that by the time the wise men made it to Herod, the child Jesus was already 2 years old. So the year would have been around 5 BC. According to secular data, April 4 BC is when Herod dies. So in order for Jesus to be at least 2 years old while Herod was alive means he had to have been born at least in 6 BC, which is 2 years prior to Herod's death. So we know that it can't be 1 AD because that's too late. So Mr. Camping narrowed it down to at least being 6 BC. We're going to look at some biblical information shortly that shows Jesus had to have been born in the later months of the year, late September or early October of 7 BC, which will rule out 6 BC. So if Jesus was born in late September or early October of 6 BC, then that would make him 1.5 years old the time the wise men made it to Jerusalem. However, if born in 7 BC in late September, early October, then he would have at least reached the age of 2 years old. So Mr. Campion understood that 7 BC fit better for that 2 age year mark. So out of 5B, 6B, and 7B, 7B fits the best and agrees with other information in the Bible, and all the time paths were discovered. So you notice all the time paths that we looked at over here. Like for example, with Moses, God has Moses' time path going from 7 BC to 33 AD. Now, 33 AD is almost even less disputed because I think it could really only be like 3 dates or 2 dates, like 30 AD or 33 or maybe 31. I'm not sure because there's only so many that fall on a Friday for Passover. And so if you look up, let me see. So you see the most commonly suggested years are AD 30 or AD 33. So Friday, April 7th of AD 30 or Friday, April 3rd of AD 33. Now, I don't know if they have this day correct, but as far as it being in the year of 33 AD, there's only pretty much narrowed down to two possibilities, right? Well, it so happens that Moses' time path doesn't take you to 30 AD. It takes you to 33 AD. And it begins, at first it takes you to 7 BC. It doesn't take you to 6 BC, right? So if you go, Moses was born in 1527. You add the 40 years, and then you times it by 38. You get exactly to 7 BC. You don't get to 6 BC, you don't get to 5 BC. And then you do 39, which 40 and 39 go hand in hand. They're related. You get to 33 AD. So time paths kind of help to prove they kind of help to build evidence for specific dates as well, because you'll see 7 BC is highlighted a lot in 33 AD, but you don't find that with like 6 BC and 5 BC. And also we have this number pattern of 40 and 39. We know that's significant. So, and then not to mention, if that weren't enough, you continue the 40s and you end up in 1994, another Jubilee, and you also end up in 2033. And so this is a very strong time path for supporting 7 BC and also 33 AD. And there's more. We haven't laid out all the time paths, but there are definitely more time paths. I believe Jacob takes you to, let's see. So starting from Jacob, when Jacob was 40 years old and when Esau was 40 years old, you can get to 33 AD. So that's Christ's death. But I believe if you start from his birth, 2007, yeah, it's exactly 2,000 years until his. So if you start from Jacob's birth and Esau's birth, because they're twins, they're born the same year, but we're going to say Jacob. So Jacob's birth, exactly 2,000 years later, is Christ is born, right? And you go another 2,000, you'll end up in 1994, and you add the one, right? But if you start from when Jacob was 40 years old, this is when Esau failed the test. He married a strange wife, and you go 2,000 years, you get to 33 AD. So that's Christ's death. And of course, if you add another 2,000 years, you get to 2033. So you can see this, another reason why we might add 2,000 years from 7 BC and also 33 AD. Well, you can do the same type of pattern from Jacob's birth and also when he's 40 years old. You're dealing with those 2,000 year increments.
Can I show my screen for a sec?
Yes. Your co-host, yep, you can do it.
All right, can you guys see this?
Yes.
Okay. So here we can see Friday, April 1st of AD 33, 14th day of the first month. And if you read Exodus 12, you'll see that it says that the Passover lamb was killed on the 14th day of the first month, which is Nisan or Abib. And so you can see this is a Friday. If you go forward 3 years, you'll see it in AD 36 is the next year where 14 Nisan falls on a Friday. And if you go backwards, you'll see the previous year. I think it was 26. Friday, March 20th of AD 26. So the last day where 14 Nisan fell on a Friday before AD 33 was in AD 26. And I also put together a spreadsheet here. I don't know if you guys can see it. But in the gray here, you have the biblical information. So what I did was I took every year, starting with Christ's birth in 7 BC, and I looked for all the Fridays. I looked at all the 14th day of the first month, and these are the biblical years. And I did it over the course of 50 years because they asked Jesus if he said he wasn't 50 years old yet. And so I looked at all the years where the 14th day of the first month fell on a Friday. And if you look right here, you can see April 1st of AD 33. The last year before that was in AD 26 on March 20th, and the next year after that would have been in March 28th of AD 36. But this is a list of all the years in the 50 years after Christ was born. So from Jubilee to Jubilee. We can't hear you, Carl.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Brian. But going back to 7 BC, trying to see where we left off. So we've narrowed down the day for Christ's birth in just several different ways. We've narrowed down the year. So going through the Jubilees, looking at the secular data, as far as when Herod was born, made us realize, okay, it couldn't have been, sorry, when Herod died, it couldn't have been before that. So that helped us in that regard. We also saw time paths for 7 BC. So you see, we pointed out that there's really no clear-cut way to get to 7 BC like we were able to with the other dates. And so this is where the timeline, started to get a little more challenging, and kind of already was challenging when she got up to the point of Esther, because even here, Mr. Camping, he never arrived at any of the dates of Esther using the Bible alone. I think there was some circumstantial evidence, but basically he was never really able to use it this way. At least with 7 BC, he was able to understand the Jubilees and how that pointed to Christ, because that had to do with setting the captives free. And so it's very fitting for Christ to be born on a Jubilee. If it was 6 BC, if it was 5 BC, it wouldn't have been a Jubilee. But now that we've pinpointed the year, now we're going to get into the month and the day. And Brian, I don't know if you want to read this next part.
Sure.
Let me just get to it. So, I'll just finish this last part. So 7B is also Jubilee year. Talked about that. Unlike those other years, and the Jubilee has everything to do with Christ. So which month in 7 BC was Jesus born? So here's an excerpt from Time Has an End, explaining how Mr. Campion arrived at October 1st, 7B, as the most likely date for Christ's birth. So if you don't mind reading this next part.
Sure. But what about the month of the year? What can we learn? In Luke chapter 1, verses 35 to 36, God records the messenger from heaven giving Mary the news of her impending conception. And the angel answered and said unto her, The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore also that holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God. And behold, thy cousin Elizabeth, she hath also conceived a son in her old age, and this is the 6th month with her who is called barren. These verses suggest that Jesus was conceived about 5 to 6 months after the pregnancy of John the Baptist was conceived in the womb of his mother Elizabeth. Since the ordinary period of pregnancy is about 9 months, the conception of John the Baptist would therefore have been 14 to 15 months before the birth of Jesus. Thus, we can determine when John the Baptist was conceived. We could fairly have a good idea when Jesus was born. Actually, I'm going to take issue with that slightly. It says she was in her 6th month. So, because we use accession versus non-accession, inclusive versus non-inclusive, that could have been 5 months plus a day, or that could have been 1 day shy of 7 months. So I would argue that it was actually a 2 month window rather than a 1 month window. So I would argue that John the Baptist would have had to have been conceived between 14 and 16 months before the birth of Christ.
What did they use, accession versus non-accession?
Well, it says in the 6th month. So that could have been 5 full months plus a day. That could have been uh, one day shy of 7 months.
I see what you mean. Yeah. There's an example. I think when Ezra went down to Babylon, it was it was the it took him 5 months to get there, I think, or it said he got there in the fifth month, right?
Yeah.
So I think that depending on the count, you know, I forgot exactly how it was worded, but it's a similar situation.
Yeah. So my point is, it could be 6 months, could be 5 months plus one day, or it could be one day shy of 7 months. So that gives you a 2 month span that you could play with.
Makes sense. Did you want to continue reading that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Um, when was John the Baptist born? The role of Zacharias and the priestly Cortland in Luke 1:5 we read, there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of Abia, and this was the life and this was the wife of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Zacharias was the father of John the Baptist, and in this verse we learn that in his priestly duties he was of the course of Abia. Therefore, we must search the Bible to learn to learn more about this course. Hebrew Abijah in First Chronicles chapter 24, we learn that the 24 divisions of the priests were 24. That is, the priesthood was divided into 24
Sorry,
courses.
he was saying that the Hebrew word for the course of Abia is Abijah. That's why it's in parentheses, Hebrew.
Yeah, sometimes God does that. Like, for example, in the Old Testament, God calls him Jonah. In the New Testament, he's called Jonas. So sometimes,
I just wanted to explain that to the listeners because the way that that was worded wasn't the best, but he's just pointing out that Abia, the Hebrew equivalent would be Abijah. So going into First Chronicles chapter 24, you're going to learn more about the courses and what that means.
where did I stop?
You're right here.
Okay. We learned that the divisions of the priests were 24. That is, the priesthood was divided into 24 courses. In verse 10, we read, the seventh to Hakaz, the eighth to Abijah. Thus Zacharias, being of the course of Abia or Abijah, served in the eighth course. These courses followed one another throughout the 12 months of the Jewish calendar. Since there are 24 courses in all, two courses would have served in each month, when the eighth course was ending its service at the end of the fourth month. Now, this is one area where I think it needs a little bit of refinement. If you use the rules of the Jewish calendar and you go back to the year the year uh, 11,005 EA, which is approximately equivalent to 8 BC, that was actually a leap year. It wasn't a leap year in the Gregorian year, but it was a leap year according to the Hebrew calendar, which means that it had 13 months. So it didn't quite align with the second half of the fourth month. It was trying to remember this off the top of my head. I think it was a defective leap year, which means it had 383 days. And if you take 16 times 24, that gets you to 384 days. But I believe that year had only 383 days, which means that most likely they would have served for a 16-day period rather than the normal 15-day period because there was an extra month in that year. But
That's something
anyway,
I'm not super familiar with, but it's something to look into. I know Mr. Camping. So basically, if there's 24 courses, what he's saying is that there's two men, right? So they were divided into 12 courses of 24,000 men each, with each course assigned it to a 1 month service. So
No, each no, what there's 12 months. What he was saying is there's 12 months in a year. But, and so each of those 24 courses would have served for half a month. So the first course would have served for the first half of the first month, the second for the second half of the first month, the third for the third for the first half of the second month, and so on. And so he's arguing that the eighth would have served the second half of the fourth month. The problem with that is that year was a leap year, not the Gregorian year, but the biblical year was a leap year, meaning rather than having 12 months, it had 13 months. And so, if it was in fact divided into 24 even pieces, uh, Zacharias's being in the eighth course would not have precisely corresponded to the end of the fourth month. It would have been off slightly because the courses, rather than being 14 or 15 days each, they would have been 16 days each, and there would have been one of the 24 courses would have been only 15 days. The other 23 courses would have been 16 days each.
okay,
And that throws the dates off a little bit. So it doesn't quite correspond to the second half of the fourth month.
okay. Yeah, that's something that we can look into more. But I can pick it up from here. Um, let's see, timing of conceptions and births. So returning to Zacharias, we read Luke 1:23 and 24. And it came to pass that as soon as the days of his ministration were accomplished, he departed to his own house, and after those days his wife Elizabeth conceived and hid herself 5 months. So this suggests that the conception of John the Baptist occurs shortly after the fourth month of the Hebrew calendar, when the course of Abia had finished. Now Brian's saying that because you have a leap year involved, that might alter this, which we can look into. But from Luke 1:36, we learn that it was in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy that Mary was told she would conceive by the Holy Spirit. Therefore, the conception of Jesus by the Holy Spirit probably took place about 6 months after the end of the fourth month. And keep in mind, we're just trying to narrow down at this point the month and the day of Jesus's birth. We already have the year, so it's not. This is just. Not sure how necessary. It's the timeline. This doesn't affect the timeline as far as the year, but Mr. Camping was never certain about the exact day that Christ was born. I think he has it for October 1st. But of course, this is always something that could be looked at more carefully to see if we can pinpoint exactly when that happened. But this is the part that we're going over, is the exact month and day. So therefore, the conception of Jesus by the Holy Spirit probably took place about 6 months after the end of the fourth month, which would mark the end of Zacharias' temple assignment. Thus, the conception of Jesus would have been close to the end of the 10th month or early in the 11th month of the Jewish calendar. If Jesus was born in 7 BC, then John the Baptist would have been conceived in 8 BC. According to the Jewish calendar, the end of the 10th month in 8 BC was December 28th on our modern calendar. So consequently, the birth of Christ would have been 9 months later, very late in September or very early in October of 7 BC. We can analyze Christ's birth date another way. The last day of the fourth month in 8 BC was July 5th, the date when Zacharias left the temple. This implies that Elizabeth conceived John the Baptist probably as early as July 15th. Therefore, John the Baptist would have been born about 9 months later, around April 15th, 7 BC. We know it was a full-term birth because Luke 1:57 records, now Elizabeth's full time came that she should be delivered, and she brought forth a son. We also know that Mary spent about 3 months with Elizabeth. And you notice here it says Elizabeth's full time. That's very similar to what we read earlier about the fullness of time that Christ would be born. So it does indicate that it has, and also we read about the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Before, you notice that verse about the 430 years. It wasn't, why does God point at that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full? It hasn't reached its fullness of time, in a sense that, once it's reached a certain point, then God brings judgment, right? And so It's kind of similar like to the church age, you could say. 1988, it reached the fullness of time when God began to bring judgment upon them. So let's see, verse 56. Uh, it and it says, and Mary abode with her about 3 months and returned to her own house. So it is reasonable to assume that Mary stayed with Elizabeth until her son John was born. Recall that in Luke 1:35 and 36, the angel informed Mary that Elizabeth had conceived and was in her 6th month, right? So, and later in verse 39, it records, and Mary said, behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to the word. And the angel departed from her. And Mary arose in those days and went into the hill country with haste in the city of Judah. Assuming it took about 2 weeks for Mary to reach Elizabeth's house, she would have been about 3.5 months pregnant when she left Elizabeth at the time John was born. Since John's birth was around April 15th, Mary would have left Elizabeth then. Therefore, Jesus would have been born about 5.5 months later in April 15th, or later than April 15th, or around October 1st. So, final conclusion. In summary, the careful placement of details concerning the course of Abia, the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, and Mary's 3-month visit with Elizabeth all point toward a specific time frame for Jesus' birth. The evidence suggests that Jesus had to have been born very close to October 1st in the year 7 BC. Moreover, when we calculate the date of the Day of Atonement in 7 BC, we find that it was October 1st, a date that fits perfectly with the conclusion that Jesus was born on the Day of Atonement. With all the foregoing evidence, may we assume that Jesus was born on the Day of Atonement? And he put a question mark, and that's how he left it. So it would fit for Jesus to have been born on October 1st, which Mr. Campion had arrived at to be the Day of Atonement, because that's, Christ came to atone, not to pay for sins, but to demonstrate the atonement that took place at the foundation. And so that's why Mr. Campion arrived at October 1st for being the possible birthday of 7 BC. But again, we don't have concrete evidence, and so we keep it at the year 7 BC for now. But I just wanted to show you that, and we're out of
Can I just interject a couple things real quick?
yeah.
One, he says October 1st in this book. In his later writings, he changed it to October 2nd. I'm not sure why, because the October 1st date does agree with the Jewish calendar, for example. Can I go back to showing my screen real quick?
Yeah, yeah. And
Okay.
then we'll have to wrap it up because they have to start the panel.
Okay. So as you can see here, 10 Tishri, Tishri is the 7th month. That does correspond to Saturday, October 1st. In Camping's later writings, he says it's October 2nd. I don't know why he changed it. He doesn't clarify, or if he does, I wasn't able to find a reason for it. But also, in regards to the 13 months, if you look at this here, 7 BC, you can see down here the 13th month, Adar 2 is grayed out. But if you go to the prior year when John the Baptist was conceived, you can see that year does have a 13th month. So, so this year when they were conceived, it does have a that corresponds to 8 BC, does have a 13th month, whereas most months, including 7 BC, the year that Christ was born, only has 12 months. And again, in this book, he says October 1st. In his later writings, he says October 2nd. I think that he was right in his earlier writings with October 1st, but he did change it to October 2nd later. I'm not sure why.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. And we'll have to start the panel discussion now.